Section 1 of In the Fog. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bob Gonzalez. In the Fog by Richard Harding Davis. Chapter 1. The grill is the club most difficult of access in the world. To be placed on its rolls distinguishes the new member as greatly as though he had received a vacant garter or had been caricatured in Vanity Fair. Men who belong to the Grill Club never mention that fact. If you were to ask one of them which club he frequents, he will name all save that particular one. He is afraid if he told you he belonged to the Grill that it would sound like boasting. The Grill Club dates back to the days when Shakespeare's theatre stood on the present site of the Times office. It has a golden grill which Charles II presented to the club, and the original manuscript of Tom and Jerry in London, which was bequeathed to it by Pierce Egan himself. The members, when they write letters at the club, still use sand to blot the ink. The Grill enjoys the distinction of having blackballed, without political prejudice, a prime minister of each party. At the same sitting at which one of these fell, it elected, on account of his brogue and his bulls, Quiller Q.C., who was then a penniless barrister. When Paul Préval, the French artist who came to London by royal command to paint a portrait of the Prince of Wales, was made an honorary member — only foreigners may be honorary members — he said as he signed his first wine card, "I would rather see my name on that than on a picture in the Louvre." At which Quiller remarked, "That's a devil of a compliment, because the only men who can read their names in the Louvre today have been dead 50 years. On the night after the great fog of 1897, there were 5 members in the club, 4 of them busy with supper and 1 reading in front of the fireplace. There is only 1 room to the club and 1 long table. At the far end of the room the fire of the grill glows red, and when the fat falls, blazes into flame, and at the other there is a broad bow window of diamond panes, which looks down upon the street. The 4 men at the table were strangers to each other, but as they picked at the grilled bones and sipped their Scotch and soda, they conversed with such charming animation that a visitor to the club, which does not tolerate visitors, would have counted them as friends of long acquaintance, certainly not as Englishmen who had met for the first time, and without the form of an introduction. But it is the etiquette and tradition of the Grill that whoever enters it must speak with whomever he finds there. It is to enforce this rule that there is but 1 long table, and whether there are 20 men at it or 2, the waiters, supporting the rule, will place them side by side. For this reason the 4 strangers at supper were seated together, with the candles grouped about them, and the long length of the table cutting a white path through the outer gloom. "I repeat," said the gentleman with the black pearl stud, "that the days for romantic adventure and deeds of foolish daring have passed, and that the fault lies with ourselves. Voyages to the Pole I do not catalogue as adventures. That African explorer, young Chetney, who turned up yesterday after he was supposed to have died in Uganda, did nothing adventurous. He made maps and explored the sources of rivers. He was in constant danger, but the presence of danger does not constitute adventure. Were that so, the chemist who studies high explosives, or who investigates deadly poisons, passes through adventures daily. No, adventures are for the adventurous. But one no longer ventures. The spirit of it has died of inertia. We are grown too practical, too just, above all, too sensible. In this room, for instance, members of this club have, at the sword's point, disputed the proper scanning of one of Pope's couplets. Over so weighty a matter as spilled Burgundy on a gentleman's cuff, 10 men fought across this table, each with his rapier in one hand and a candle in the other. All 10 were wounded. The question of the spilled Burgundy concerned but 2 of them. The 8 others were engaged because they were men of spirit. They were, indeed, the first gentlemen of the day. To-night, were you to spill Burgundy on my cuff, Were you even to insult me grossly, these gentlemen would not consider it incumbent upon them to kill each other. They would separate us, and tomorrow morning appear as witnesses against us at Bow Street. We have here tonight, in the persons of Sir Andrew and myself, an illustration of how the ways have changed." The men around the table turned and glanced toward the gentleman in front of the fireplace. He was an elderly and somewhat portly person, with a kindly, wrinkled countenance, which wore continually a smile of almost childish confidence and good nature. It was a face which the illustrated prince had made intimately familiar. He held a book from him at arm's length, as if to adjust his eyesight, and his brows were knit with interest. "Now, were this the 18th century," continued the gentleman with the black pearl, "when Sir Andrew left the club tonight, I would have him bound and gagged and thrown into a sedan chair. The watch would not interfere, the passers-by would take to their heels, my hired bullies and ruffians would convey him to some lonely spot, where we would guard him until morning. Nothing would come of it, except added reputation to myself as a gentleman of adventurous spirit, and possibly an essay in the Tatler, with stars for names, entitled, let us say, The Budget and the Baronet." "But to what end, sir?" inquired the youngest of the members. "And why Sir Andrew, of all persons? Why should you select him for this adventure?" The gentleman with the black pearl shrugged his shoulders. "It would prevent him from speaking in the House tonight. The Navy Increase Bill," he added gloomily. "It is a government measure, and Sir Andrew speaks for it. And so great is his influence, and so large his following, that if he does," the gentleman laughed ruefully, "if he does, it will go through. Now, had I the spirit of our ancestors," he exclaimed, "I would bring chloroform from the nearest chemist's and drug him in that chair. I would tumble his unconscious form into a hansom cab and hold him prisoner until daylight. If I did, I would save the British taxpayer the cost of 5 more battleships, many millions of pounds." The gentleman again turned and surveyed the baronet with freshened interest. The honorary member of the Grill, whose accent already had betrayed him as an American, laughed softly. "To look at him now," he said, "one would not guess he was deeply concerned with the affairs of state." The others nodded silently. "He has not lifted his eyes from that book since we first entered," added the youngest member. "He surely cannot mean to speak tonight." "Oh, yes, he will speak," muttered the one with the black pearl moodily. "During these last hours of the session the House sits late. But when the Navy Bill comes up on its 3rd reading, he will be in his place. And he will pass it." The 4th member, a stout and florid gentleman of a somewhat sporting appearance, in a short smoking jacket and black tie, sighed enviously. "Fancy one of us being as cool as that if he knew he had to stand up within an hour and rattle off a speech in Parliament. I'd be in a devil of a funk myself, and yet he is as keen over that book he's reading as though he had nothing before him until bedtime." "Yes, see how eager he is," whispered the youngest member. "He does not lift his eyes even now when he cuts the pages. It is probably an Admiralty report, or some other weighty work of statistics which bears upon his speech." The gentleman with the black pearl laughed morosely. "The weighty work in which the eminent statesman is so deeply engrossed," he said, "is called The Great Rand Robbery. It is a detective novel, for sale at all bookstalls." The American raised his eyebrows in disbelief. "The Great Rand Robbery?" he repeated incredulously. "What an odd taste!" "It is not a taste, it is his vice," returned the gentleman with the pearl stud. "It is his one dissipation. He is noted for it. You, as a stranger, could hardly be expected to know of this idiosyncrasy. Mr. Gladstone sought relaxation in the Greek poets. Sir Andrew finds his in Gaboriau. Since I have been a member of Parliament, I have never seen him in the library without a shilling shocker in his hands. He brings them even into the sacred precincts of the House, and from the government benches reads them concealed inside his hat. Once started on a tale of murder, robbery, and sudden death, nothing can tear him from it. Not even the call of the division bell, nor of hunger, nor the prayers of the party whip. He gave up his country house, because when he journeyed to it in the train, he would become so absorbed in his detective stories that he was invariably carried past his station. The Member of Parliament twisted his pearl stud nervously, and bit at the edge of his moustache. If it were only the first pages of the Rand robbery that he were reading, he murmured bitterly, instead of the last. With such another book as that, I swear I could hold him here until morning. There would be no need of chloroform to keep him from the house. The eyes of all were fastened upon Sir Andrew, and each saw with fascination that with his forefinger he was now separating the last 2 pages of the book. The Member of Parliament struck the table softly with his open palm. "I would give £100," he whispered, "if I could place in his hands at this moment a new story of Sherlock Holmes. £1,000. He added wildly, £5,000. The American observed the speaker sharply, as though the words bore to him some special application, and then, at an idea which apparently had but just come to him, smiled in great embarrassment. Sir Andrew ceased reading, but as though still under the influence of the book, sat looking blankly into the open fire. For a brief space no one moved until the baronet withdrew his eyes and, with a sudden start of recollection, felt anxiously for his watch. He scanned its face eagerly and scrambled to his feet. The voice of the American instantly broke the silence in a high, nervous accent. "And yet Sherlock Holmes himself," he cried, "could not decipher the mystery which tonight baffles the police of London." At these unexpected words, which carried in them something of the tone of a challenge, the gentlemen about the table started as suddenly as though the American had fired a pistol in the air, and Sir Andrew halted abruptly and stood observing him with grave surprise. The gentleman with the black pearl was the first to recover. "Yes, yes," he said eagerly, throwing himself across the table. "A mystery that baffles the police of London. I have heard nothing of it. Tell us at once. Pray do tell us at once." The American flushed uncomfortably and picked uneasily at the tablecloth. "No one but the police has heard of it," he murmured, "and they only through me. It is a remarkable crime to which, unfortunately, I am the only person who can bear witness. Because I am the only witness, I am, in spite of my immunity as a diplomat, detained in London by the authorities of Scotland Yard. My name," he said, inclining his head politely, "is Sears, Lieutenant Ripley Sears of the United States Navy, at present naval attaché to the court of Russia. Had I not been detained today by the police, I would have started this morning for Petersburg." The gentleman with the black pearl interrupted with so pronounced an exclamation of excitement and delight that the American stammered and ceased speaking. "Do you hear, Sir Andrew?" cried the Member of Parliament jubilantly. "An American diplomat halted by our police because he is the only witness of a most remarkable crime. The most remarkable crime, I believe you said, sir," he added, bending eagerly toward the naval officer, "which has occurred in London in many years." The American moved his head in assent and glanced at the 2 other members. They were looking doubtfully at him, and the face of each showed that he was greatly perplexed. Sir Andrew advanced to within the light of the candles and drew a chair toward him. "The crime must be exceptional indeed," he said, "to justify the police in interfering with a representative of a friendly power. If I were not forced to leave at once, I should take the liberty of asking you to tell us the details." The gentleman with the pearl pushed the chair towards Sir Andrew and motioned him to be seated. "You cannot leave us now," he exclaimed. "Mr. Sears is just about to tell us of this remarkable crime." He nodded vigorously at the naval officer, and the American, after first glancing doubtfully toward the servants at the far end of the room, leaned forward across the table. The others drew their chairs nearer and bent toward him. The baronet glanced irresolutely at his watch, and with an exclamation of annoyance snapped down the lid. "They can wait," he muttered. He seated himself quickly and nodded at Lieutenant Sears. "If you will be so kind as to begin, sir," he said impatiently. "Of course," said the American. "You understand that I am speaking to gentlemen. The confidences of this club are inviolate. Until the police give the facts to the public press, I must consider you my confederates. You have heard nothing. You know no one connected with this mystery. Even I must remain anonymous." The gentlemen seated around him nodded gravely. "Of course," the baronet assented with eagerness. "Of course." "We will refer to it," said the gentleman with the black pearl, "as the story of the naval attaché." "I arrived in London 2 days ago," said the American, "and I engaged a room at the Bath Hotel. I know very few people in London, and even the members of our embassy were strangers to me. But in Hong Kong I became great pals with an officer in your navy, who has since retired, and who is now living in a small house in Rutland Gardens, opposite the Knightsbridge Barracks. I telegraphed him that I was in London, and yesterday morning I received a most hearty invitation to dine with him the same evening at his house. He is a bachelor, so we dined alone, and talked over all our old days on the Asiatic station, and of the changes which had come to us since we had last met there. As I was leaving the next morning for my post at Petersburg, and had many letters to write, I told him, about 10 o'clock, that I must get back to the hotel, and he sent out his servant to call a hansom. For the next quarter of an hour, as we sat talking, we could hear the cab whistle sounding violently from the doorstep, but apparently with no result. "It cannot be that the cabmen are on strike," my friend said, as he rose and walked to the window. He pulled back the curtains, and at once called to me. "You have never seen a London fog, have you?" he asked. "Well, come here. This is one of the best, or rather, one of the worst of them." I joined him at the window, but I could see nothing. Had I not known that the house looked out upon the street, I would have believed that I was facing a dead wall. I raised the sash and stretched out my head, but still I could see nothing. Even the light of the street lamps opposite and in the upper windows of the barracks had been smothered in the yellow mist. The lights of the room in which I stood penetrated the fog only to the distance of a few inches from my eyes. Below me the servant was still sounding his whistle, but I could afford to wait no longer, and told my friend that I would try to find the way to my hotel on foot. He objected, but the letters I had to write were for the Navy Department, and besides I had always heard that to be out in a London fog was the most wonderful experience, and I was curious to investigate one for myself. My friend went with me to his front door, and laid down a course for me to follow. I was first to walk straight across the street to the brick wall of the Knightsbridge Barracks. I was then to feel my way along the wall until I came to a row of houses set back from the sidewalk. They would bring me to a cross street. On the other side of this street was a row of shops, which I was to follow until they joined the iron railings of Hyde Park. I was to keep to the railings until I reached the gates at Hyde Park Corner, where I was to lay a diagonal course across Piccadilly and tack in toward the railings of Green Park. At the end of these railings, going east, I would find the Walsingham and my own hotel. To a sailor the course did not seem difficult, so I bade my friend good night, and walked forward until my feet touched the paving. I continued upon it until I reached the curbing of the sidewalk. A few steps further, and my hands struck the wall of the barracks. I turned in the direction from which I had just come, and saw a square of faint light cut in the yellow fog. I shouted, "All right," and the voice of my friend answered, "Good luck to you." The light from his open door disappeared with a bang, and I was left alone in a dripping yellow darkness. I have been in the Navy for 10 years, but I have never known such a fog as that of last night, not even among the icebergs of Bering Sea. There one at least could see the light of the binnacle, but last night I could not even distinguish the hand by which I guided myself along the barrack wall. At sea a fog is a natural phenomenon. It is as familiar as the rainbow which follows a storm. It is as proper that a fog should spread upon the waters as that steam shall rise from a kettle. But a fog which springs from the paved streets, that rolls between solid house fronts, that forces cabs to move at half speed, that drowns policemen and extinguishes the electric lights of the music hall. That to me is incomprehensible. It is as out of place as a tidal wave on Broadway. As I felt my way along the wall, I encountered other men who were coming from the opposite direction, and each time when we hailed each other I stepped away from the wall to make room for them to pass. But the third time I did this, when I reached out my hand, the wall had disappeared, and the further I moved to find it, the further I seemed to be sinking into space. I had the unpleasant conviction that at any moment I might step over a precipice. Since I had set out I had heard no traffic in the street, and now, although I listened some minutes, I could only distinguish the occasional footfalls of pedestrians. Several times I called aloud, and once a jocular gentleman answered me, but only to ask me where I thought he was, and then even he was swallowed up in the silence. Just above me I could make out a jet of gas, which I guessed came from a street lamp, and I moved over to that, and while I tried to recover my bearings, kept my hand on the iron post. Except for this flicker of gas, no larger than the tip of my finger, I could distinguish nothing about me. For the rest, the mist hung between me and the world like a damp and heavy blanket. I could hear voices, but I could not tell from whence they came, and the scrape of a foot moving cautiously, or a muffled cry as someone stumbled, were the only sounds that reached me. I decided that until someone took me in tow, I had best remain where I was, and it must have been for 10 minutes that I waited by the lamp, straining my ears and hailing distant footfalls. In a house near me, some people were dancing to the music of a Hungarian band. I even fancied I could hear the windows shake to the rhythm of their feet, but I could not make out from which part of the compass the sounds came. And sometimes as the music rose, it seemed close at my hand, and again to be floating high in the air above my head. Although I was surrounded by thousands of householders, 13, I was as completely lost as though I had been set down by night in the Sahara Desert. There seemed to be no reason in waiting longer for an escort, so I again set out, and at once bumped against a low iron fence. At first I believed this to be an area railing, but on following it I found that it stretched for a long distance, and that it was pierced at regular intervals with gates. I was standing uncertainly with my hand on one of these, when a square of light suddenly opened in the night, and in it I saw, as you see a picture thrown by a biograph in a darkened theatre, a young gentleman in evening dress, and back of him the lights of a hall. I guessed from its elevation and distance from the sidewalk that this light must come from the door of a house set back from the street, and I determined to approach it and ask the young man to tell me where I was. But in fumbling with the lock of the gate I instinctively bent my head, and when I raised it again the door had partly closed, leaving only a narrow shaft of light. Whether the young man had re-entered the house or had left it I could not tell, but I hastened to open the gate, and as I stepped forward I found myself upon an asphalt walk, and at the same instant there was the sound of quick steps upon the path, and someone rushed past me. I called to him, but he made no reply, and I heard the gate click and the footsteps hurrying away upon the sidewalk. Under other circumstances the young man's rudeness and his recklessness in dashing so hurriedly through the mist would have struck me as peculiar, but everything was so distorted by the fog that at the moment I did not consider it. The door was still as he had left it, partly open. I went up to the path, and after much fumbling, found the knob of the doorbell and gave it a sharp pull. The bell answered me from a great depth and distance, but no movement followed from inside the house, and although I pulled the bell again and again, I could hear nothing save the dripping of the mist about me. I was anxious to be on my way, but unless I knew where I was going, there was little chance of my making any speed, and I was determined that until I learned my bearings, I would not venture back into the fog. So I pushed the door open and stepped into the house. I found myself in a long and narrow hall, upon which doors opened from either side. At the end of the hall was a staircase with a balustrade which ended in a sweeping curve. The balustrade was covered with heavy Persian rugs, and the walls of the hall were also hung with them. The door on my left was closed, but the one nearer me, on the right, was open, and as I stepped opposite to it, I saw that it was a sort of reception or waiting room, and that it was empty. The door below it was also open, and with the idea that I would surely find someone there, I walked on up the hall. I was in evening dress, and I felt I did not look like a burglar, so I had no great fear that, should I encounter one of the inmates of the house, he would shoot me on sight. The second door in the hall opened into a dining room. This was also empty. One person had been dining at the table, but the cloth had not been cleared away, and a flickering candle showed half-filled wine-glasses and the ashes of cigarettes. The greater part of the room was in complete darkness. By this time I had grown conscious of the fact that I was wandering about in a strange house, and that apparently I was alone in it. The silence of the place began to try my nerves, and in a sudden, unexplainable panic, I started for the open street. But as I turned, I saw a man sitting on a bench, which the curve of the balustrade had hidden from me. His eyes were shut, and he was sleeping soundly. The moment before I had been bewildered because I could see no one, but at the sight of this man I was much more bewildered. He was a very large man, a giant in height, with long yellow hair which hung below his shoulders. He was dressed in a red silk shirt that was belted at the waist and hung outside black velvet trousers, which in turn were stuffed into high black boots. I recognized the costume at once as that of a Russian servant. But what a Russian servant in his native livery could be doing in a private house in Knightsbridge was incomprehensible. I advanced and touched the man on the shoulder, and after an effort he awoke, and on seeing me sprang to his feet and began bowing rapidly and making deprecatory gestures. I had picked up enough Russian in Petersburg to make out that the man was apologizing for having fallen asleep, and I also was able to explain to him that I desired to see his master. He nodded vigorously and said, "Will the Excellency come this way? The princess is here." I distinctly made out the word princess, and I was a good deal embarrassed. I had thought it would be easy enough to explain my intrusion to a man, but how a woman would look at it was another matter, and as I followed him down the hall I was somewhat puzzled. As we advanced, he noticed that the front door was standing open, and with an exclamation of surprise, hastened toward it and closed it. Then he rapped twice on the door of what was apparently the drawing-room. There was no reply to his knock, and he tapped again, and then timidly and cringing subserviently opened the door and stepped inside. He withdrew himself at once and stared stupidly at me, shaking his head. "She is not there," he said. He stood for a moment gazing blankly through the open door, and then hastened toward the dining-room. The solitary candle which still burned there seemed to assure him that the room also was empty. He came back and bowed me toward the drawing-room. "She is above," he said. "I will inform the princess of the Excellency's presence." Before I could stop him, he had turned and was running up the staircase, leaving me alone at the open door of the drawing-room. I decided that the adventure had gone quite far enough, and if I had been able to explain to the Russian that I had lost my way in the fog and only wanted to get back into the street again, I would have left the house on the instant. Of course, when I first rang the bell of the house, I had no other expectation than that it would be answered by a parlour-maid who would direct me on my way. I certainly could not then foresee that I would disturb a Russian princess in her boudoir, or that I might be thrown out by her athletic bodyguard. Still, I thought I ought not now to leave the house without making some apology, and if the worst should come, I could show my card. They could hardly believe that a member of an embassy had any designs upon the hat-rack. The room in which I stood was dimly lighted, but I could see that, like the hall, it was hung with heavy Persian rugs. The corners were filled with palms, and there was an unmistakable odor in the air of Russian cigarettes, and strange, dry scents that carried me back to the bazaars of Vladivostok. Near the front windows was a grand piano, and at the other end of the room a heavily carved screen of some black wood, picked out with ivory. The screen was overhung with a canopy of silken draperies, and formed a sort of alcove. In front of the alcove was spread the white skin of a polar bear, and set on that was one of those low Turkish coffee tables. It held a lighted spirit lamp and 2 gold coffee cups. I had heard no movement from above stairs, and it must have been fully 3 minutes that I stood waiting, noting these details of the room and wondering at the delay, and at the strange silence. And then, suddenly, as my eye grew more used to the half-light, I saw, projecting from behind the screen as though it were stretched along the back of a divan, the hand of a man and the lower part of his arm. I was as startled as though I had come across a footprint on a deserted island. Evidently the man had been sitting there since I had come into the room, even since I had entered the house, and he had heard the servant knocking upon the door. Why he had not declared himself I could not understand, but I supposed that possibly he was a guest, with no reason to interest himself in the princess's other visitors, or perhaps, for some reason, he did not wish to be observed. I could see nothing of him except his hand, but I had an unpleasant feeling that he had been peering at me through the carving in the screen, and that he was still doing so. I moved my feet noisily on the floor, and said tentatively, "I beg your pardon." There was no reply, and the hand did not stir. Apparently the man was bent upon ignoring me, but as all I wished was to apologize for my intrusion and to leave the house, I walked up to the alcove and peered around it. Inside the screen was a divan piled with cushions, and on the other end of it, nearer me, the man was sitting. He was a young Englishman, with light yellow hair and a deeply bronzed face. He was seated with his arms stretched out along the back of the divan, and with his head resting against a cushion. His attitude was one of complete ease, but his mouth had fallen open, and his eyes were set with an expression of utter horror. At the first glance I saw that he was quite dead. For a flash of time I was too startled to act, but in the same flash I was convinced that the man had met his death from no accident, that he had not died through any ordinary failure of the laws of nature. The expression on his face was much too terrible to be misinterpreted. It spoke as eloquently as words. It told me that before the end had come, he had watched his death approach and threaten him. I was so sure he had been murdered that I instinctively looked on the floor for the weapon, and at the same moment, out of concern for my own safety, quickly behind me, but the silence of the house continued unbroken. I have seen a great number of dead men. I was on the Asiatic station during the Japanese-Chinese War. I was in Port Arthur after the massacre. So a dead man, for the single reason that he is dead, does not repel me, and, though I knew that there was no hope that this man was alive, still, for decency's sake, I felt his pulse, and while I kept my ears alert for any sound from the floors above me, I pulled open his shirt and placed my hand upon his heart. My fingers instantly touched upon the opening of a wound, and as I withdrew them, I found them wet with blood. He was in evening dress, and in the wide bosom of his shirt I found a narrow slit, so narrow that in the dim light it was scarcely discernible. The wound was no wider than the smallest blade of a pocket-knife, but when I stripped the shirt away from the chest and left it bare, I found that the weapon, narrow as it was, had been long enough to reach his heart. There is no need to tell you how I felt as I stood by the body of this boy, for he was hardly older than a boy, or of the thoughts that came into my head. I was bitterly sorry for this stranger, bitterly indignant at his murderer, and at the same time selfishly concerned for my own safety and for the notoriety which I saw was sure to follow. My instinct was to leave the body where it lay and to hide myself in the fog. But I also felt that since a succession of accidents had made me the only witness to a crime, my duty was to make myself a good witness and to assist to establish the facts of this murder. That it might possibly be a suicide and not a murder did not disturb me for a moment. The fact that the weapon had disappeared and the expression on the boy's face were enough to convince at least me that he had had no hand in his own death. I judged it therefore of the first importance to discover who was in the house, or if they had escaped from it, who had been in the house before I entered it. I had seen one man leave it, but all I could tell of him was that he was a young man, that he was in evening dress, and that he had fled in such haste that he had not stopped to close the door behind him. The Russian servant I had found apparently asleep, and unless he acted a part with supreme skill, he was a stupid and ignorant boor, and as innocent of the murder as myself. There was still the Russian princess whom he had expected to find, or had pretended to expect to find, in the same room with the murdered man. I judged that she must now be either upstairs with the servant, or that she had, without his knowledge, already fled from the house. When I recalled his apparently genuine surprise at not finding her in the drawing-room, this latter supposition seemed the more probable. Nevertheless, I decided that it was my duty to make a search, and after a second hurried look for the weapon among the cushions of the divan and upon the floor, I cautiously crossed the hall and entered the dining-room. The single candle was still flickering in the draught, and showed only the white cloth. The rest of the room was draped in shadows. I picked up the candle, and, lifting it high above my head, moved around the corner of the table. Either my nerves were on such a stretch that no shock could strain them further, or my mind was inoculated to horrors, for I did not cry out at what I saw nor retreat from it. Immediately at my feet was the body of a beautiful woman, lying at full length upon the floor, her arms flung out on either side of her, and her white face and shoulders gleaming dully in the unsteady light of the candle. Around her throat was a great chain of diamonds, and the light played upon these and made them flash and blaze in tiny flames. But the woman who wore them was dead, and I was so certain as to how she had died that without an instant's hesitation I dropped on my knees beside her and placed my hands above her heart. My fingers again touched the thin slit of a wound. I had no doubt in my mind but that this was the Russian princess, and when I lowered the candle to her face I was assured that this was so. Her features showed the finest lines of both the Slav and the Jewess. The eyes were black, the hair blue-black and wonderfully heavy, and her skin, even in death, was rich in color. She was a surpassingly beautiful woman. I rose and tried to light another candle with the one I held, but I found that my hand was so unsteady that I could not keep the wicks together. It was my intention to again search for this strange dagger which had been used to kill both the English boy and the beautiful princess. But before I could light the second candle, I heard footsteps descending the stairs, and the Russian servant appeared in the doorway. My face was in darkness, or I am sure that at the sight of it he would have taken alarm, for at that moment I was not sure but that this man himself was the murderer. His own face was plainly visible to me in the light from the hall, and I could see that it wore an expression of dull bewilderment. I stepped quickly toward him and took a firm hold upon his wrist. "She is not there," he said. "The princess has gone. They have all gone." "Who have gone?" I demanded. "Who else has been here?" "The 2 Englishmen," he said. "What 2 Englishmen?" I demanded. "What are their names?" The man now saw by my manner that some question of great moment hung upon his answer, and he began to protest that he did not know the names of the visitors, and that until that evening he had never seen them. I guessed that it was my tone which frightened him, so I took my hand off his wrist and spoke less eagerly. "How long have they been here?" I asked. "And when did they go?" He pointed behind him toward the drawing-room. "One sat there with the princess," he said. "The other came after I had placed the coffee in the drawing-room. The 2 Englishmen talked together, and the princess returned here to the table. She sat there in that chair, and I brought her cognac and cigarettes. Then I sat outside upon the bench. It was a feast day, and I had been drinking. Pardon, Your Excellency, but I fell asleep. When I woke, Your Excellency was standing by me. But the princess and the 2 Englishmen had gone. That is all I know." I believed that the man was telling me the truth. His fright had passed, and he was now apparently puzzled, but not alarmed. "You must remember the names of the Englishmen," I urged. "Try to think. When you announced them to the princess, what name did you give?" At this question he exclaimed with pleasure, and, beckoning to me, ran hurriedly down the hall and into the drawing-room. In the corner furthest from the screen was the piano, and on it was a silver tray. He picked this up, and, smiling with pride at his own intelligence, pointed at 2 cards that lay upon it. I took them up and read the names engraved upon them. The American paused abruptly and glanced at the faces about him. "I read the names," he repeated. He spoke with great reluctance. "Continue," cried the baronet sharply. "I read the names said the American with evident distaste, "and the family name of each was the same. They were the names of two brothers. One is well known to you. It is that of the African explorer of whom this gentleman was just speaking. I mean the Earl of Chetney. The other was the name of his brother, Lord Arthur Chetney." The men at the table fell back as though a trap door had fallen open at their feet. "Lord Chetney!" they exclaimed in chorus. They glanced at each other and back to the American with every expression of concern and disbelief. "It is impossible!" cried the baronet. "Why, my dear sir, young Chetney only arrived from Africa yesterday. It was so stated in the evening papers." The jaw of the American set in a resolute square, and he pressed his lips together. "You are perfectly right, sir," he said. "Lord Chetney did arrive in London yesterday morning, and yesterday night I found his dead body." End of section 1. Section 2 of In the Fog. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bob Gonzalez. In the Fog by Richard Harding Davis. Chapter 1, continued. The youngest member present was the first to recover. He seemed much less concerned over the identity of the murdered man than at the interruption of the narrative. "Oh, please let him go on," he cried. "What happened then? You say you found two visiting cards. How do you know which card was that of the murdered man?" The American, before he answered, waited until the chorus of exclamations had ceased. Then he continued as though he had not been interrupted. "The instant I read the names upon the cards," he said, "I ran to the screen and, kneeling beside the dead man, began a search through his pockets. My hand at once fell upon a card case, and I found on all the cards it contained the title of the Earl of Chetney. His watch and cigarette case also bore his name. These evidences, and the fact of his bronzed skin, and that his cheekbones were worn with fever, convinced me that the dead man was the African explorer, and the boy who had fled past me in the night was Arthur, his younger brother. I was so intent upon my search that I had forgotten the servant, and I was still on my knees when I heard a cry behind me. I turned and saw the man gazing down at the body in abject horror. Before I could rise, he gave another cry of terror, and flinging himself into the hall, raced toward the door to the street. I leaped after him, shouting to him to halt, but before I could reach the hall he had torn open the door, and I saw him spring out into the yellow fog. I cleared the steps in a jump and ran down the garden walk, but just as the gate clicked in front of me. I had it open on the instant, and following the sound of the man's footsteps, I raced after him across the open street. He also could hear me, and he instantly stopped running, and there was an absolute silence. He was so near that I almost fancied I could hear him panting, and I held my own breath to listen. But I could distinguish nothing but the dripping of the mist about us, and from far off the music of the Hungarian band, which I had heard when I first lost myself. All I could see was the square of light from the door I had left open behind me, and a lamp in the hall beyond it flickering in the draught. But even as I watched it, the flame of the lamp was blown violently to and fro, and the door, caught in the same current of air, closed slowly. I knew if it shut I could not again enter the house, and I rushed madly toward it. I believe I even shouted out as though it were something human which I could compel to obey me. And then I caught my foot against the curb and smashed into the sidewalk. When I rose to my feet I was dizzy and half stunned, and though I thought then that I was moving toward the door, I know now that I probably turned directly from it. For as I groped about in the night, calling frantically for the police, my fingers touched nothing but the dripping fog, and the iron railings for which I sought seemed to have melted away. For many minutes I beat the mist with my arms like one at blind man's buff, turning sharply in circles, cursing aloud at my stupidity and crying continually for help. At last a voice answered me from the fog, and I found myself held in the circle of a policeman's lantern. That is the end of my adventure. What I have to tell you now is what I learned from the police. At the station house to which the man guided me, I related what you have just heard. I told them that the house they must at once find was one set back from the street within a radius of 200 yards from the Knightsbridge barracks, that within 50 yards of it someone was giving a dance to the music of a Hungarian band, and that the railings before it were as high as a man's waist and filed to a point. With that to work upon, 20 men were at once ordered out into the fog to search for the house, and Inspector Lyle himself was dispatched to the home of Lord Edam, Chetney's father, with a warrant for Lord Arthur's arrest. I was thanked and dismissed on my own recognizance. This morning Inspector Lyle called on me, and from him I learned the police theory of the scene I have just described. Apparently I had wandered very far in the fog, for up to noon today the house had not been found, nor had they been able to arrest Lord Arthur. He did not return to his father's house last night, and there is no trace of him. But from what the police knew of the past lives of the people I found in that lost house, they have evolved a theory, and their theory is that the murders were committed by Lord Arthur. The infatuation of his elder brother, Lord Chetney, for a Russian princess, so Inspector Lyle tells me, is well known to everyone. About 2 years ago the Princess Zichy, as she calls herself, and he were constantly together, and Chetney informed his friends that they were about to be married. The woman was notorious in 2 continents, and when Lord Edam heard of his son's infatuation, he appealed to the police for her record. It is through his having applied to them that they know so much concerning her and her relations with the Chetneys. From the police, Lord Edam learned that Madame Zichy had once been a spy in the employ of the Russian Third Section, but that lately she had been repudiated by her own government, and was living by her wits, by blackmail, and by her beauty. Lord Edam laid this record before his son, but Chetney either knew it already, or the woman persuaded him not to believe it, and the father and son parted in great anger. 2 days later the Marquis altered his will, leaving all of his money to the younger brother, Arthur. The title and some of the landed property he could not keep from Chetney, but he swore if his son saw the woman again that the will should stand as it was, and he would be left without a penny. This was about 18 months ago, when apparently Chetney tired of the princess and suddenly went off to shoot and explore in Central Africa. No word came from him, except that twice he was reported as having died of fever in the jungle, and finally 2 traders reached the coast who said they had seen his body. This was accepted by all as conclusive, and young Arthur was recognized as the heir to the Edam millions. On the strength of this supposition, he at once began to borrow enormous sums from the moneylenders. This is of great importance, as the police believe it was these debts which drove him to the murder of his brother. Yesterday, as you know, Lord Chetney suddenly returned from the grave, and it was the fact that for 2 years he had been considered as dead which lent such importance to his return, and which gave rise to those columns of detail concerning him which appeared in all the afternoon papers. But obviously during his absence he had not tired of the Princess Zichy, for we know that a few hours after he reached London he sought her out. His brother, who had also learned of his reappearance through the papers, probably suspected which would be the house he would first visit, and followed him there, arriving, so the Russian servant tells us, while the 2 were at coffee in the drawing-room. The princess then, we also learn from the servant, withdrew to the dining-room, leaving the 2 brothers together. What happened one can only guess. Lord Arthur knew now that, when it was discovered he was no longer the heir, the moneylenders would come down upon him. The police believe that he at once sought out his brother to beg for money to cover the post obits, but that, considering the sum he needed was several hundreds of thousands of pounds, Chetney refused to give it him. No one knew that Arthur had gone to seek out his brother. They were alone. It is possible, then, that in a passion of disappointment, and crazed with the disgrace which he saw before him, young Arthur made himself the heir beyond further question. The death of his brother would have availed nothing if the woman remained alive. It is then possible that he crossed the hall, and with the same weapon that made him Lord Edam's heir, destroyed the solitary witness to the murder. The only other person who could have seen it was sleeping in a drunken stupor, to which fact undoubtedly he owed his life. And yet, concluded the naval attaché, leaning forward and marking each word with his finger, Lord Arthur blundered fatally. In his haste, he left the door of the house open, so giving access to the first passer-by, and he forgot that when he entered it, he had handed his card to the servant. That piece of paper may yet send him to the gallows. In the meantime he has disappeared completely, and somewhere in one of the millions of streets of this great capital, in a locked and empty house, lies the body of his brother and of the woman his brother loved, undiscovered, unburied, and with their murder unavenged. In the discussion which followed the conclusion of the story of the naval attaché, the gentleman with the pearl took no part. Instead, he arose, and beckoning a servant in a far corner of the room, whispered earnestly to him, until a sudden movement on the part of Sir Andrew caused him to return hurriedly to the table. "There are several points in Mr. Sears's story I want explained," he cried. "Be seated, Sir Andrew," he begged. "Let us have the opinion of an expert. I do not care what the police think. I want to know what you think." But Sir Henry rose reluctantly from his chair. "I should like nothing better than to discuss this," he said, "but it is most important that I proceed to the house. I should have been there some time ago." He turned toward the servant and directed him to call a hansom. The gentleman with the pearl stud looked appealingly at the naval attaché. "There are surely many details which you have not told us," he urged. "Some you have forgotten." The baronet interrupted quickly. "I trust not," he said, "for I could not possibly stop to hear them." "The story is finished," declared the naval attaché, "until Lord Arthur is arrested or the bodies are found. There is nothing more to tell of either Chetney or the Princess Zichy." "Of Lord Chetney, perhaps not," interrupted the sporting-looking gentleman with the black tie. "But there'll always be something to tell of the Princess Zichy. I know enough stories about her to fill a book. She was a most remarkable woman." The speaker dropped the end of his cigar into his coffee-cup, and, taking his case from his pocket, selected a fresh one. As he did so he laughed and held up the case that the others might see it. It was an ordinary cigar case of well-worn pigskin, with a silver clasp. "The only time I ever met her," he said, "she tried to rob me of this." The baronet regarded him closely. "She tried to rob you?" he repeated. "Tried to rob me of this," continued the gentleman in the black tie, "and of the Czarina's diamonds." His tone was one of mingled admiration and injury. "The Czarina's diamonds!" exclaimed the baronet. He glanced quickly and suspiciously at the speaker, and then at the others about the table, but their faces gave evidence of no other emotion than that of ordinary interest. "Yes, the Czarina's diamonds," repeated the man with the black tie. "It was a necklace of diamonds. I was told to take them to the Russian ambassador in Paris, who was to deliver them at Moscow. I am a Queen's messenger," he added. "Oh, I see," exclaimed Sir Andrew in a tone of relief. "And you say that this same Princess Zichy, one of the victims of this double murder, endeavored to rob you of that cigar case?" "And the Czarina's diamonds," answered the Queen's messenger imperturbably. "It's not much of a story, but it gives you an idea of the woman's character. The robbery took place between Paris and Marseilles." The baronet interrupted him with an abrupt movement. "No, no," he cried, shaking his head in protest. "Do not tempt me. I really cannot listen. I must be at the house in 10 minutes." "I am sorry," said the Queen's messenger. He turned to those seated about him. "I wonder if the other gentleman," he inquired tentatively. There was a chorus of polite murmurs, and the Queen's messenger, bowing his head in acknowledgment, took a preparatory sip from his glass. At the same moment the servant to whom the man with the black pearl had spoken slipped a piece of paper into his hand. He glanced at it, frowned, and threw it under the table. The servant bowed to the baronet. "Your hansom is waiting, Sir Andrew," he said. "The necklace was worth £20,000, began the Queen's messenger. "It was a present from the Queen of England to celebrate—" The baronet gave an exclamation of angry annoyance. "Upon my word, this is most provoking," he interrupted. "I really ought not to stay. But I certainly mean to hear this." He turned irritably to the servant. "Tell the hansom to wait," he commanded, and with an air of a boy who is playing truant, slipped guiltily into his chair. The gentleman with the black pearl smiled blandly and rapped upon the table. "Order, gentlemen," he said. "Order for the story of the Queen's Messenger and the Czarina's diamonds." Chapter 2. "The necklace was a present from the Queen of England to the Czarina of Russia," began the Queen's Messenger. "It was to celebrate the occasion of the Tsar's coronation. Our Foreign Office knew that the Russian ambassador in Paris was to proceed to Moscow for that ceremony, and I was directed to go to Paris and turn over the necklace to him. But when I reached Paris, I found that he had not expected me for a week later, and was taking a few days' vacation at Nice. His people asked me to leave the necklace with them at the embassy, but I had been charged to get a receipt for it from the ambassador himself, so I started at once for Nice. The fact that Monte Carlo is not 2,000 miles from Nice may have had something to do with making me carry out my instructions so carefully. Now, how the Princess Zichy came to find out about the necklace, I don't know, but I can guess. As you have just heard, she was at one time a spy in the service of the Russian government, and after they dismissed her, she kept up her acquaintance with many of the Russian agents in London. It is probable that through one of them she learned that the necklace was to be sent to Moscow, and which one of the Queen's messengers had been detailed to take it there. Still, I doubt if even that knowledge would have helped her, if she had not also known something which I supposed no one else in the world knew but myself and one other man. And curiously enough, the other man was a Queen's messenger too, and a friend of mine. You must know that up to the time of this robbery I had always concealed my dispatches in a manner peculiarly my own. I got the idea from that play called A Scrap of Paper. In it a man wants to hide a certain compromising document. He knows that all his rooms will be secretly searched for it, so he puts it in a torn envelope and sticks it up where anyone can see it, on his mantel shelf. The result is that the woman who is ransacking the house to find it looks in all the unlikely places, but passes over the scrap of paper that is just under her nose. Sometimes the papers and packages they give us to carry about Europe are of very great value, and sometimes they are special makes of cigarettes and orders to court dressmakers. Sometimes we know what we are carrying, and sometimes we do not. If it is a large sum of money or a treaty, they generally tell us, but as a rule we have no knowledge of what the package contains, so to be on the safe side, we naturally take just as great care of it as though we knew it held the terms of an ultimatum or the crown jewels. As a rule, my confrères carry the official packages in a despatch box, which is just as obvious as a lady's jewel bag in the hands of her maid. Everyone knows they are carrying something of value. They put a premium on dishonesty. Well, after I saw the scrap of paper play, I determined to put the government valuables in the most unlikely place that anyone would look for them. So I used to hide the documents they gave me inside my riding boots, and small articles, such as money or jewels, I carried in an old cigar case. After I took to using my case for that purpose, I bought a new one, exactly like it, for my cigars. But to avoid mistakes, I had my initials placed on both sides of the new one, and the moment I touched the case, even in the dark, I could tell which it was by the raised initials. No one knew of this except the Queen's messenger of whom I spoke. We once left Paris together on the Orient Express. I was going to Constantinople, and he was to stop off at Vienna. On the journey I told him of my peculiar way of hiding things, and showed him my cigar case. If I recollect rightly, on that trip it held the Grand Cross of St. Michael and St. George, which the Queen was sending to our ambassador. The messenger was very much entertained at my scheme, and some months later, when he met the princess, he told her about it as an amusing story. Of course he had no idea she was a Russian spy. He didn't know anything at all about her, except that she was a very attractive woman. It was indiscreet, but he could not possibly have guessed that she could ever make any use of what he told her. Later, after the robbery, I remembered that I had informed this young chap of my secret hiding place, and when I saw him again I questioned him about it. He was greatly distressed, and said he had never seen the importance of the secret. He remembered he had told several people of it, and among others the Princess Zichy. In that way I found out that it was she who had robbed me, and I know that from the moment I left London she was following me, and that she knew then that the diamonds were concealed in my cigar case. My train for Nice left Paris at 10 in the morning. When I travel at night I generally tell the chef de gare that I am a Queen's messenger, and he gives me a compartment to myself. But in the daytime I take whatever offers. On this morning I had found an empty compartment, and I had tipped the guard to keep everyone else out, not from any fear of losing the diamonds, but because I wanted to smoke. He had locked the door, and as the last bell had rung I supposed I was to travel alone, so I began to arrange my traps and to make myself comfortable. The diamonds in the cigar case were in the inside pocket of my waistcoat, and as they made a bulky package, I took them out, intending to put them in my handbag. It is a small satchel like a bookmaker's, or those handbags that couriers carry. I wear it slung from a strap across my shoulder, and no matter whether I am sitting or walking, it never leaves me. I took the cigar case which held the necklace from my inside pocket, and the case which held the cigars out of the satchel, and while I was searching through it for a box of matches, I laid the two cases beside me on the seat. At that moment the train started, but at the same instant there was a rattle at the lock of the compartment, and a couple of porters lifted and shoved a woman through the door, and hurled her rugs and umbrellas in after her. Instinctively I reached for the diamonds. I shoved them quickly into the satchel, and pushing them far down to the bottom of the bag, snapped the spring lock. Then I put the cigars in the pocket of my coat, but with the thought that now that I had a woman as a travelling companion, I would probably not be allowed to enjoy them. One of her pieces of luggage had fallen at my feet, and a roll of rugs had landed at my side. I thought if I hid the fact that the lady was not welcome, and at once endeavoured to be civil, she might permit me to smoke. So I picked up her handbag off the floor, and asked her where I might place it. As I spoke, I looked at her for the first time, and saw that she was a most remarkably handsome woman. She smiled charmingly, and begged me not to disturb myself. Then she arranged her own things about her, and opening her dressing bag, took out a gold cigarette case. "Do you object to smoke?" she asked. I laughed and assured her that I had been in great terror lest she might object to it herself. "If you like cigarettes," she said, "will you try some of these? They are rolled specially for my husband in Russia, and they are supposed to be very good." I thanked her and took one from her case, and I found it so much better than my own that I continued to smoke her cigarettes throughout the rest of the journey. I must say that we got on very well. I judged from the coronet on her cigarette case, and from her manner, which was quite as well bred as that of any woman I ever met, that she was someone of importance, and though she seemed almost too good-looking to be respectable, I determined that she was some grande dame who was so assured of her position that she could afford to be unconventional. At first she read her novel, and then she made some comment on the scenery, and finally we began to discuss the current politics of the continent. She talked of all the cities in Europe, and seemed to know every one worth knowing, but she volunteered nothing about herself, except that she frequently made use of the expression, "when my husband was stationed at Vienna," or "when my husband was promoted to Rome." Once she said to me, "I have often seen you at Monte Carlo. I saw you when you won the pigeon championship." I told her that I was not a pigeon shot, and she gave a little start of surprise. "Oh, I beg your pardon," she said. "I thought you were Morton Hamilton, the English champion." As a matter of fact, I do look like Hamilton, but I know now that her object was to make me think that she had no idea as to who I really was. She needn't have acted at all, for I certainly had no suspicions of her, and was only too pleased to have so charming a companion. The one thing that should have made me suspicious was the fact that at every station she made some trivial excuse to get me out of the compartment. She pretended that her maid was travelling back of us in one of the second-class carriages, and kept saying she could not imagine why the woman would not come to look after her. And if the maid did not turn up at the next stop, would I be so very kind as to get out and bring her whatever it was she pretended she wanted? I had taken my dressing-case from the rack to get out a novel, and had left it on the seat opposite to mine and at the end of the compartment farthest from her. And once when I came back from buying her a cup of chocolate, or some other fool errand, I found her standing at the end of the compartment with both hands on the dressing-bag. She looked at me without so much as winking an eye, and shoved the case carefully into a corner. "Your bag slipped off on the floor," she said. "If you've got any bottles in it, you had better look and see that they are not broken." And I give you my word, I was such an ass that I did open the case and looked all through it. She must have thought I was a juggins. I get hot all over whenever I remember it. But in spite of my dullness and her cleverness, she couldn't gain anything by sending me away, because what she wanted was in the handbag, and every time she sent me away the handbag went with me. After the incident of the dressing-case her manner changed. Either in my absence she had had time to look through it, or when I was examining it for broken bottles she had seen everything it held. From that moment she must have been certain that the cigar-case in which she knew I carried the diamonds was in the bag that was fastened to my body, and from that time on she probably was plotting how to get it from me. Her anxiety became most apparent. She dropped the great lady manner, and her charming condescension went with it. She ceased talking, and when I spoke, answered me irritably or at random. No doubt her mind was entirely occupied with her plan. The end of our journey was drawing rapidly nearer, and her time for action was being cut down with the speed of the express train. Even I, unsuspicious as I was, noticed that something was very wrong with her. I really believe that before we reached Marseilles, if I had not, through my own stupidity, given her the chance she wanted, she might have stuck a knife in me and rolled me out on the rails. But as it was, I only thought that the long journey had tired her. I suggested that it was a very trying trip, and asked her if she would allow me to offer her some of my cognac. She thanked me and said no. And then suddenly her eyes lighted, and she exclaimed, "Yes, thank you, if you will be so kind." My flask was in the handbag, and I placed it on my lap, and with my thumb slipped back the catch. As I keep my tickets and railroad guide in the bag, I am so constantly opening it that I never bother to lock it, and the fact that it is strapped to me has always been sufficient protection. But I can appreciate now what a satisfaction and what a torment, too, it must have been to that woman when she saw that the bag opened without a key. While we were crossing the mountains I had felt rather chilly, and had been wearing a light racing coat. But after the lights were lighted the compartment became very hot and stuffy, and I found the coat uncomfortable. So I stood up, and after first slipping the strap of the bag over my head, I placed the bag in the seat next to me and pulled off the racing coat. I don't blame myself for being careless. The bag was still within reach of my hand, and nothing would have happened if, at that exact moment, the train had not stopped at Arles. It was the combination of my removing the bag and our entering the station at the same instant which gave the Princess Zichy the chance she wanted to rob me. I needn't say that she was clever enough to take it. The train ran into the station at full speed and came to a sudden stop. I had just thrown my coat into the rack and had reached out my hand for the bag. In another instant I would have had the strap around my shoulder, but at that moment the princess threw open the door of the compartment and beckoned wildly at the people on the platform. "Natalie," she called, "Natalie, here I am. Come here, this way." She turned upon me in the greatest excitement. "My maid," she cried. "She's looking for me. She passed the window without seeing me. Go, please, and bring her back." She continued pointing out the door and beckoning me with her other hand. There certainly was something about that woman's tone which made one jump. When she was giving orders you had no chance to think of anything else. So I rushed out on my errand of mercy, and then rushed back again to ask what the maid looked like. "In black," she answered. rising and blocking the door of the compartment. All in black, with a bonnet. The train waited 3 minutes at Arles, and in that time I suppose I must have rushed up to over 20 women and asked, "Are you Natalie?" The only reason I wasn't punched with an umbrella or handed over to the police was that they probably thought I was crazy. When I jumped back into the compartment, the princess was seated where I had left her, but her eyes were burning with happiness. She placed her hand on my arm almost affectionately and said in a hysterical way, "You are very kind to me. I am so sorry to have troubled you." I protested that every woman in the platform was dressed in black. "Indeed, I am so sorry," she said, laughing, and she continued to laugh until she began to breathe so quickly that I thought she was going to faint. I can see now that the last part of that journey must have been a terrible half-hour for her. She had the cigar case safe enough, but she knew that she herself was not safe. She understood if I were to open my bag, even at the last minute, and miss the case, I would know positively that she had taken it. I had placed the diamonds in the bag at the very moment she entered the compartment, and no one but our two selves had occupied it since. She knew that when we reached Marseilles she would either be £20,000 richer than when she left Paris, or that she would go to jail. That was the situation as she must have read it, and I don't envy her state of mind during that last half-hour. It must have been hell. I saw that something was wrong, and in my innocence I even wondered if possibly my cognac had not been a little too strong, for she suddenly developed into a most brilliant conversationalist, and applauded and laughed at everything I said, and fired off questions at me like a machine gun, so that I had no time to think of anything but what she was saying. Whenever I stirred, she stopped her chattering and leaned toward me, and watched me like a cat over a mouse-hole. I wondered how I could have considered her an agreeable travelling companion. I thought I would have preferred to be locked in with a lunatic. I don't like to think how she would have acted if I had made a move to examine the bag, but as I had it safely strapped around me again, I did not open it, and I reached Marseilles alive. As we drew into the station, she shook hands with me and grinned at me like a Cheshire cat. "I cannot tell you," she said, "how much I have to thank you for. What do you think of that for impudence?" I offered to put her in a carriage, but she said she must find Natalie, and that she hoped we would meet again at the hotel. So I drove off by myself, wondering who she was and whether Natalie was not her keeper. I had to wait several hours for the train to Nice, and as I wanted to stroll around the city, I thought I had better put the diamonds in the safe of the hotel. As soon as I reached my room, I locked the door, placed the handbag on the table, and opened it. I felt among the things at the top of it, but failed to touch the cigar case. I shoved my hand in deeper and stirred the things about, but still I did not reach it. A cold wave swept down my spine, and a sort of emptiness came to the pit of my stomach. Then I turned red-hot, and the sweat sprung out all over me. I wet my lips with my tongue and said to myself, "Don't be an ass. Pull yourself together, pull yourself together. Take the things out, one at a time. It's there, of course it's there. Don't be an ass." So I put a brake on my nerves and began very carefully to pick out the things one by one. But after another second I could not stand it, and I rushed across the room and threw out everything on the bed. But the diamonds were not among them. I pulled the things about and tore them open and shuffled and rearranged and sorted them. But it was no use. The cigar case was gone. I threw everything in the dressing case out on the floor, although I knew it was useless to look for it there. I knew that I had put it in the bag. I sat down and tried to think. I remembered I had put it in the satchel at Paris, just as the woman had entered the compartment, and I had been alone with her ever since. So it was she who had robbed me. But how? It had never left my shoulder. And then I remembered that it had, that I had taken it off when I had changed my coat, and for the few moments that I was searching for Natalie. I remembered that the woman had sent me on that goose chase, and that at every other station she had tried to get rid of me on some fool errand. I gave a roar like a mad bull, and I jumped down the stairs 6 steps at a time. I demanded at the office if a distinguished lady of title, possibly a Russian, had just entered the hotel. As I expected, she had not. I sprang into a cab and inquired at 2 other hotels, and then I saw the folly of trying to catch her without outside help, and I ordered the fellow to gallop to the office of the chief of police. I told my story, and the arse in charge asked me to calm myself and wanted to take notes. I told him this was no time for taking notes, but for doing something. He got wrathy at that, and I demanded to be taken at once to his chief. The chief, he said, was very busy and could not see me, so I showed him my silver greyhound. In 11 years I had never used it but once before. I stated in pretty vigorous language that I was a Queen's messenger, and that if the chief of police did not see me instantly, he would lose his official head. At that the fellow jumped off his high horse and ran with me to his chief, a smart young chap, a colonel in the army, and a very intelligent man. I explained that I had been robbed in a French railway carriage of a diamond necklace belonging to the Queen of England, which Her Majesty was sending as a present to the Tsarina of Russia. I pointed out to him that if he succeeded in capturing the thief, he would be made for life, and would receive the gratitude of 3 great powers. He wasn't the sort that thinks second thoughts are best. He saw Russian and French decorations sprouting all over his chest, and he hit a bell and pressed buttons and yelled out orders like the captain of a penny steamer in a fog. He sent her description to all the city gates, and ordered all cabmen and railway porters to search all trains leaving Marseille. He ordered all passengers on outgoing vessels to be examined, and telegraphed the proprietors of every hotel and pension to send him a complete list of their guests within the hour. While I was standing there, he must have given at least 100 orders, and sent out enough commissaires, sergeants de ville, gendarmes, bicycle police, and plain-clothes Johnnies to have captured the entire German army. When they had gone, he assured me that the woman was as good as arrested already. Indeed, officially she was arrested, for she had no more chance of escape from Marseille than from the Chateau d'If. He told me to return to my hotel and possess my soul in peace. Within an hour, he assured me, he would acquaint me with her arrest. I thanked him and complimented him on his energy, and left him. But I didn't share in his confidence. I felt that she was a very clever woman, and a match for any and all of us. It was all very well for him to be jubilant. He had not lost the diamonds, and had everything to gain if he found them, while I, even if he did recover the necklace, would only be where I was before I lost them. And if he did not recover it, I was a ruined man. It was an awful facer for me. I had always prided myself on my record. In 11 years I had never mislaid an envelope, nor missed taking the first train, and now I had failed in the most important mission that had ever been entrusted to me, and it wasn't a thing that could be hushed up either. It was too conspicuous, too spectacular. It was sure to invite the widest notoriety. I saw myself ridiculed all over the continent, and perhaps dismissed, even suspected of having taken the thing myself. I was walking in front of a lighted cafe, and I felt so sick and miserable that I stopped for a pick-me-up. Then I considered that if I took one drink, I would probably, in my present state of mind, not want to stop under 20, and I decided I had better leave it alone. But my nerves were jumping like a frightened rabbit, and I felt I must have something to quiet them, or I would go crazy. I reached for my cigarette case, but a cigarette seemed hardly adequate. So I put it back again and took out this cigar case, in which I keep only the strongest and blackest cigars. I opened it and stuck in my fingers, but instead of a cigar, they touched on a thin leather envelope. My heart stood perfectly still. I did not dare to look, but I dug my fingernails into the leather, and I felt layers of thin paper, then a layer of cotton, and then they scratched on the facets of the Tsarina's diamonds. I stumbled as though I had been hit in the face, and fell back into one of the chairs on the sidewalk. I tore off the wrappings and spread out the diamonds on the cafe table. I could not believe they were real. I twisted the necklace between my fingers and crushed it between my palms and tossed it up in the air. I believe I almost kissed it. The women in the cafe stood tip on the chairs to see better, and laughed and screamed, and the people crowded so close around me that the waiters had to form a bodyguard. The proprietor thought there was a fight and called for the police. I was so happy I didn't care. I laughed too, and gave the proprietor a £5 note and told him to stand everyone a drink. Then I tumbled into a fiacre and galloped off to my friend the chief of police. I felt very sorry for him. He had been so happy at the chance I gave him, and he was sure to be disappointed when he learned I had sent him off on a false alarm. But now that I had found the necklace, I did not want him to find the woman. Indeed, I was most anxious that she should get clear away, for if she were caught, the truth would come out, and I would likely get a sharp reprimand, and sure to be laughed at. I could see now how it happened. In my haste to hide the diamonds when the woman was hustled into the carriage, I had shoved the cigars into the satchel and the diamonds into the pocket of my coat. Now that I had the diamonds safe again, it seemed a very natural mistake, but I doubted if the Foreign Office would think so. I was afraid it might not appreciate the beautiful simplicity of my secret hiding-place. So when I reached the police station and found that the woman was still at large, I was more than relieved. As I expected, the chief was extremely chagrined when he learned of my mistake, and that there was nothing for him to do. But I was feeling so happy myself that I hated to have anyone else miserable. So I suggested that this attempt to steal the Tsarina's necklace might be only the first of a series of such attempts by an unscrupulous gang, and that I might still be in danger. I winked at the chief, and the chief smiled at me, and we went to Nice together in a saloon car with a guard of 12 carabineers and 12 plainclothesmen, and the chief and I drank champagne all the way. We marched together up to the hotel where the Russian ambassador was stopping, closely surrounded by our escort of carabineers, and delivered the necklace with the most profound ceremony. The old ambassador was immensely impressed, and when we hinted that already I had been made the object of an attack by robbers, he assured me that His Imperial Majesty would not prove ungrateful. I wrote a swinging personal letter about the invaluable services of the chief of the French Minister of Foreign Affairs, and they gave him enough Russian and French medals to satisfy even a French soldier. So, though he never caught the woman, he received his just reward. The Queen's messenger paused and surveyed the faces of those about him in some embarrassment. But the worst of it is, he added, that the story must have got about. For while the princess obtained nothing from me but a cigar case and 5 excellent cigars, a few weeks after the coronation the Tsar sent me a gold cigar case with his monogram in diamonds, and I don't know yet whether that was a coincidence or whether the Tsar wanted me to know that he knew that I had been carrying the Tsarina's diamonds in my pigskin cigar case. What do you fellows think? End of section 2. Section 3 of In the Fog. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bob Gonzalez. In the Fog by Richard Harding Davis. Chapter 3. Sir Andrew rose with disapproval written in every lineament. "I thought your story would bear upon the murder," he said. "Had I imagined it would have nothing whatsoever to do with it, I would not have remained." He pushed back his chair and bowed stiffly. "I wish you good night," he said. There was a chorus of remonstrance, and under cover of this and the baronet's answering protests, a servant for the second time slipped a piece of paper into the hand of the gentleman with the pearl stud. He read the lines written upon it and tore it into tiny fragments. The youngest member, who had remained an interested but silent listener to the tale of the Queen's messenger, raised his hand commandingly. "Sir Andrew," he cried, "in justice to Lord Arthur Chetney, I must ask you to be seated. He has been accused in our hearing of a most serious crime, and I insist that you remain until you have heard me clear his character." "You?" cried the baronet. "Yes," answered the young man briskly. "I would have spoken sooner," he explained, "but that I thought this gentleman," he inclined his head toward the Queen's messenger, "was about to contribute some facts of which I was ignorant. He, however, has told us nothing, and so I will take up the tale at the point where Lieutenant Sears laid it down, and give you those details of which Lieutenant Sears is ignorant. It seems strange to you that I should be able to add the sequel to this story, but the coincidence is easily explained. I am the junior member of the law firm of Chudley and Chudley. We have been solicitors for the Chetneys for the last 200 years. Nothing, no matter how unimportant, which concerns Lord Edam and his 2 sons is unknown to us, and naturally we are acquainted with every detail of the terrible catastrophe of last night." The baronet, bewildered but eager, sank back into his chair. "Will you be long, sir?" he demanded. "I shall endeavor to be brief," said the young solicitor. "And," he added, in a tone which gave his words almost the weight of a threat, "I promise to be interesting." "There is no need to promise that," said Sir Andrew. "I find it much too interesting as it is." He glanced ruefully at the clock and turned his eyes quickly from it. "Tell the driver of that hansom," he called to the servant, "that I take him by the hour." "For the last 3 days," began young Mr. Chudley, "as you have probably read in the daily papers, the Marquis of Edam has been at the point of death, and his physicians have never left his house. Every hour he seemed to grow weaker, but although his bodily strength is apparently leaving him forever, his mind has remained clear and active. Late yesterday evening word was received at our office that he wished my father to come at once to Chetney House and to bring with him certain papers. What these papers were is not essential. I mention them only to explain how it was that last night I happened to be at Lord Edam's bedside. I accompanied my father to Chetney House, but at the time we reached there Lord Edam was sleeping, and his physicians refused to have him awakened. My father urged that he should be allowed to receive Lord Edam's instructions concerning the documents, but the physicians would not disturb him, and we all gathered in the library to wait until he should awake of his own accord. It was about 1 o'clock in the morning, while we were still there, that Inspector Lyle and the officers of Scotland Yard came to arrest Lord Arthur on the charge of murdering his brother. You can imagine our dismay and distress. Like everyone else, I had learned from the afternoon papers that Lord Chetney was not dead, but that he had returned to England, and on arriving at Chetney House I had been told that Lord Arthur had gone to the Bath Hotel to look for his brother, and to inform him that if he wished to see their father alive, he must come to him at once. Although it was now past 1 o'clock, Arthur had not returned. None of us knew where Madame Zichy lived, so we could not go to recover Lord Chetney's body. We spent a most miserable night, hastening to the window whenever a cab came into the square, in the hope that it was Arthur returning, and endeavoring to explain away the facts that pointed to him as the murderer. I am a friend of Arthur's. I was with him at Harrow and at Oxford, and I refused to believe for an instant that he was capable of such a crime. But as a lawyer I could not help but see that the circumstantial evidence was strongly against him. Toward early morning Lord Edam awoke, and in so much better a state of health that he refused to make the changes in the papers which he had intended, declaring that he was no nearer death than ourselves. Under other circumstances this happy change in him would have relieved us greatly, but none of us could think of anything save the death of his eldest son and of the charge which hung over Arthur. As long as Inspector Lyle remained in the house, my father and I decided that I, as one of the legal advisers of the family, should also remain there, but there was little for either of us to do. Arthur did not return, and nothing occurred until late this morning, when Lyle received word that the Russian servant had been arrested. He at once drove to Scotland Yard to question him. He came back to us in an hour, and informed me that the servant had refused to tell anything of what had happened the night before, or of himself, or of the Princess Zichy. He would not even give them the address of her house. He is in abject terror, Lyle said. I assured him that he was not suspected of the crime, but he would tell me nothing. There were no other developments until 2 o'clock this afternoon, when word was brought to us that Arthur had been found, and that he was lying in the accident ward of St. George's Hospital. Lyle and I drove there together, and found him propped up in bed with his head bound in a bandage. He had been brought to the hospital the night before by the driver of a hansom that had run over him in the fog. The cab-horse had kicked him on the head, and he had been carried in unconscious. There was nothing on him to tell who he was, and it was not until he came to his senses this afternoon that the hospital authorities had been able to send word to his people. Lyle at once informed him that he was under arrest, and with what he was charged, and though the inspector warned him to say nothing which might be used against him, I, as his solicitor, instructed him to speak freely, and to tell us all he knew of the occurrences of last night. It was evident to anyone that the fact of his brother's death was of much greater concern to him than that he was accused of his murder. That, Arthur said contemptuously, that is damned nonsense. It is monstrous and cruel. We parted better friends than we have been in years. I will tell you all that happened, not to clear myself, but to help you find out the truth. His story is as follows. Yesterday afternoon, owing to his constant attendance on his father, he did not look at the evening papers, and it was not until after dinner, when the butler brought him one and told him of its contents, that he learned that his brother was alive and at the Bath Hotel. He drove there at once, but was told that about 8 o'clock his brother had gone out, but without giving any clue of his destination. As Chetney had not at once come to see his father, Arthur decided that he was still angry with him, and his mind, turning naturally to the cause of their quarrel, determined him to look for Chetney at the home of the Princess Zichy. Her house had been pointed out to him, and though he had never visited it, he had passed it many times and knew its exact location. He accordingly drove in that direction as far as the fog would permit the hansom to go, and walked the rest of the way, reaching the house about 9 o'clock. He rang and was admitted by the Russian servant. The man took his card into the drawing-room, and at once his brother ran out and welcomed him. He was followed by the Princess Zichy, who also received Arthur most cordially. "You brothers will have much to talk about," she said. "I am going to the dining-room. When you have finished, let me know." As soon as she left them, Arthur told his brother that their father was not expected to outlive the night, and that he must come to him at once. "This is not the moment to remember your quarrel," Arthur said to him. "You have come back from the dead only in time to make your peace with him before he dies." Arthur says that at this Chetney was greatly moved. "You entirely misunderstand me, Arthur," he returned. "I did not know the governor was ill, or I would have gone to him the instant I arrived. My only reason for not doing so was because I thought he was still angry with me. I shall return with you immediately, as soon as I have said good-bye to the princess. It is a final good-bye. After tonight I shall never see her again." "Do you mean that?" Arthur cried. "Yes," Chetney answered. "When I returned to London I had no intention of seeking her again, and I am here only through a mistake." He then told Arthur that he had separated from the princess even before he went to Central Africa, and that moreover, while at Cairo on his way south, he had learned certain facts concerning her life there during the previous season, which made it impossible for him ever to wish to see her again. Their separation was final and complete. "She deceived me cruelly," he said. "I cannot tell you how cruelly. During the 2 years when I was trying to obtain my father's consent to our marriage, she was in love with a Russian diplomat. During all that time he was secretly visiting her here in London, and her trip to Cairo was only an excuse to meet him there." "Yet you are here with her tonight," Arthur protested, "only a few hours after your return." "That is easily explained," Chetney answered. "As I finished dinner tonight at the hotel, I received a note from her from this address. In it she said she had just learned of my arrival, and begged me to come to her at once. She wrote that she was in great and present trouble, dying of an incurable illness, and without friends or money. She begged me, for the sake of old times, to come to her assistance. During the last 2 years in the jungle, all my former feeling for Zichy had utterly passed away, but no one could have dismissed the appeal she made to me in that letter. So I came here and found her, as you have seen her, quite as beautiful as she ever was, in very good health, and, from the look of the house, in no need of money. I asked her what she meant by writing me that she was dying in a garret, and she laughed and said she had done so because she was afraid, unless I thought she needed help, I would not try to see her. That was where we were when you arrived. And now, Chetney added, I will say good-bye to her, and you had better return home. No, you can trust me. I shall follow you at once. She has no influence over me now, but I believe, in spite of the way she has used me, that she is, after her queer fashion, still fond of me, and when she learns that this good-bye is final, there may be a scene, and it is not fair to her that you should be here. So go home at once, and tell the governor that I am following you in 10 minutes. That, said Arthur, is the way we parted. I never left him on more friendly terms. I was happy to see him alive again. I was happy to think he had returned in time to make up his quarrel with my father. And I was happy that at last he was shut of that woman. I was never better pleased with him in my life. He turned to Inspector Lyle, who was sitting at the foot of the bed, taking notes of all he told us. Why, in the name of common sense, he cried, should I have chosen that moment of all others to send my brother back to the grave? For a moment the inspector did not answer him. I do not know if any of you gentlemen are acquainted with Inspector Lyle, but if you are not, I can assure you that he is a very remarkable man. Our firm often applies to him for aid, and he has never failed us. My father has the greatest possible respect for him. Where he has the advantage over the ordinary police official is in the fact that he possesses imagination. He imagines himself to be the criminal, imagines how he would act under the same circumstances, and he imagines to such purpose that he generally finds the man he wants. I have often told Lyle that if he had not been a detective, he would have made a great success as a poet or a playwright. When Arthur turned on him, Lyle hesitated for a moment, and then told him exactly what was the case against him. Ever since your brother was reported as having died in Africa, he said, your lordship has been collecting money on post-obits. Lord Chetney's arrival last night turned them into waste paper. You were suddenly in debt for thousands of pounds, for much more than you could ever possibly pay. No one knew that you and your brother had met at Madame Zichy's, but you knew that your father was not expected to outlive the night, and that if your brother were dead also, you would be saved from complete ruin, and that you would become the Marquis of Edam. Oh, that is how you have worked it out, is it? Arthur cried. And for me to become Lord Edam, was it necessary that the woman should die too? They will say, Lyle answered, that she was a witness to the murder, that she would have told. Then why did I not kill the servant as well? Arthur said. He was asleep and saw nothing. And you believe that? Arthur demanded. It is not a question of what I believe, Lyle said gravely. It is a question for your peers. The man is insolent, Arthur cried. The thing is monstrous, horrible. Before we could stop him, he sprang out of his cot and began pulling on his clothes. When the nurses tried to hold him down, he fought with them. Do you think you can keep me here, he shouted, when they are plotting to hang me? I am going with you to that house, he cried at Lyle. When you find those bodies, I shall be beside you. It is my right. He is my brother. He has been murdered, and I can tell you who murdered him. That woman murdered him. She first ruined his life, and now she has killed him. For the last 5 years she has been plotting to make herself his wife, and last night, when he told her he had discovered the truth about the Russian, and that she would never see him again, she flew into a passion and stabbed him, and then, in terror of the gallows, killed herself. She murdered him, I tell you, and I promise you that we will find the knife she used near her, perhaps still in her hand. What will you say to that? Lyle turned his head away and stared down at the floor. I might say, he answered, that you placed it there. Arthur gave a cry of anger and sprang at him, and then pitched forward into his arms. The blood was running from the cut under the bandage, and he had fainted. Lyle carried him back to the bed again, and we left him with the police and the doctors, and drove at once to the address he had given us. We found the house not 3 minutes' walk from St. George's Hospital. It stands in Trevor Terrace, that little row of houses set back from Knightsbridge, with one end in Hill Street. As we left the hospital, Lyle had said to me, "You must not blame me for treating him as I did. All is fair in this work, and if by angering that boy I could have made him commit himself, I was right in trying to do so, though I assure you no one would be better pleased than myself if I could prove his theory to be correct. But we cannot tell. Everything depends upon what we see for ourselves within the next few minutes." When we reached the house, Lyle broke open the fastenings of one of the windows on the ground floor, and, hidden by the trees in the garden, we scrambled in. We found ourselves in the reception room, which was the first room on the right of the hall. The gas was still burning behind the colored glass and red silk shades, and when the daylight streamed in after us, it gave the hall a hideously dissipated look, like the foyer of a theatre at a matinee, or the entrance to an all-day gambling hell. The house was oppressively silent, and because we knew why it was so silent, we spoke in whispers. When Lyle turned the handle of the drawing-room door, I felt as though someone had put his hand upon my throat, but I followed close at his shoulder and saw in the subdued light of many-tinted lamps the body of Chetney at the foot of the divan, just as Lieutenant Sears had described it. In the drawing-room we found the body of the Princess Zichy, her arms thrown out, and the blood from her heart frozen in a tiny line across her bare shoulder. But neither of us, although we searched the floor on our hands and knees, could find the weapon which had killed her. "For Arthur's sake," I said, "I would have given £1,000 if we had found the knife in her hand, as he said we would." "That we have not found it there," Lyle answered, "is to my mind the strongest proof that he is telling the truth, that he left the house before the murder took place. He is not a fool, and had he stabbed his brother and this woman, he would have seen that by placing the knife near her he could help to make it appear as if she had killed Chetney and then committed suicide. Besides, Lord Arthur insisted that the evidence in his behalf would be our finding the knife here. He would not have urged that if he knew we would not find it, if he knew that he himself had carried it away. This is no suicide. A suicide does not rise and hide the weapon with which he kills himself, and then lie down again. No, this has been a double murder, and we must look outside of the house for the murderer." While he was speaking, Lyle and I had been searching every corner, studying the details of each room. I was so afraid that without telling me he would make some deductions prejudicial to Arthur that I never left his side. I was determined to see everything that he saw, and, if possible, to prevent his interpreting it in the wrong way. He finally finished his examination, and we sat down together in the drawing-room, and he took out his notebook and read aloud all that Mr. Sears had told him of the murder and what we had just learned from Arthur. We compared the two accounts word for word and weighed statement with statement, but I could not determine from anything Lyle said which of the two versions he had decided to believe. "We are trying to build a house of blocks," he exclaimed, "with half of the blocks missing. We have been considering two theories," he went on. "One, that Lord Arthur was responsible for the murders, and the other that the dead woman in there is responsible for one of them and has committed suicide. But until the Russian servant is ready to talk, I shall refuse to believe the guilt of either." "What can you prove by him?" I asked. "He was drunk and asleep. He saw nothing." Lyle hesitated, and then, as though he had made up his mind to be quite frank with me, spoke freely. "I do not know he was either drunk or asleep," he answered. "Lieutenant Sears describes him as a stupid boor. I am not satisfied that he is not a clever actor. What was his position in this house? What was his real duty here? Suppose it was not to guard this woman, but to watch her. Let us imagine that it was not the woman he served, but a master, and see where that leads us. For this house has a master, a mysterious absentee landlord who lives in St. Petersburg, the unknown Russian who came between Chetney and Zichy, and because of whom Chetney left her. He is the man who bought this house for Madame Zichy, who sent these rugs and curtains from St. Petersburg to furnish it for her after his own tastes. And I believe it was he also who placed the Russian servant here, ostensibly to serve the princess, but in reality to spy upon her. At Scotland Yard we do not know who this gentleman is. The Russian police confess to equal ignorance concerning him. When Lord Chetney went to Africa, Madame Zichy lived in St. Petersburg, but there her receptions and dinners were so crowded with members of the nobility and of the army and diplomats that, among so many visitors, the police could not learn which was the one for whom she most greatly cared. Lyle pointed to the modern French paintings and the heavy silk rugs which hung upon the walls. "The unknown is a man of taste and of some fortune," he said. "Not the sort of man to send a stupid peasant to guard the woman he loves. So I am not content to believe with Mr. Sears that the servant is a boor. I believe him instead to be a very clever ruffian. I believe him to be the protector of his master's honor, or, let us say, of his master's property, whether that property be silver plate or the woman his master loves. Last night, after Lord Arthur had gone away, the servant was left alone in this house with Lord Chetney and Madame Zichy. From where he sat in the hall, he could hear Lord Chetney bidding her farewell, for if my idea of him is correct, he understands English quite as well as you or I. Let us imagine that he heard her entreating Chetney not to leave her, reminding him of his former wish to marry her, and let us suppose that he hears Chetney denounce her, and tell her that at Cairo he has learned of this Russian admirer, the servant's master. He hears the woman declare that she has had no admirer but himself, and that this unknown Russian was and is nothing to her, and that there is no man she loves but him, and that she cannot live knowing that he is alive without his love. Suppose Chetney believed her, suppose his former infatuation for her returned, and that in a moment of weakness he forgave her and took her in his arms. That is the moment the Russian master has feared. It is to guard against it that he has placed his watchdog over the princess. And how do we know but that, when the moment came, the watchdog served his master, as he saw his duty, and killed them both? What do you think? Lyle demanded. Would not that explain both murders? I was only too willing to hear any theory which pointed to anyone else as the criminal than Arthur, but Lyle's explanation was too utterly fantastic. I told him that he certainly showed imagination, but that he could not hang a man for what he imagined he had done. No, Lyle answered, but I can frighten him by telling him what I think he has done. And now, when I again question the Russian servant, I will make it quite clear to him that I believe he is the murderer. I think that will open his mouth. A man will at least talk to defend himself. Come, he said, we must return at once to Scotland Yard and see him. There is nothing more to do here. He arose, and I followed him into the hall, and in another minute we would have been on our way to Scotland Yard. But just as he opened the street door, a postman halted at the gate of the garden and began fumbling with the latch. Lyle stopped, with an exclamation of chagrin. "How stupid of me!" he exclaimed. He turned quickly and pointed to a narrow slit cut in the brass plate of the front door. "The house has a private letter-box," he said, "and I had not thought to look in it. If we had gone out as we came in by the window, I would never have seen it. The moment I entered the house, I should have thought of securing the letters which came this morning. I have been grossly careless." He stepped back into the hall and pulled at the lid of the letter-box, which hung on the inside of the door, but it was tightly locked. At the same moment the postman came up the steps holding a letter. Without a word, Lyle took it from his hand and began to examine it. It was addressed to the Princess Zichy, and on the back of the envelope was the name of a West End dressmaker. "That is of no use to me," Lyle said. He took out his card and showed it to the postman. "I am Inspector Lyle from Scotland Yard," he said. "The people in this house are under arrest. Everything it contains is now in my keeping. Did you deliver any other letters here this morning?" The man looked frightened, but answered promptly that he was now upon his third round. He had made one postal delivery at 7 that morning and another at 11. "How many letters did you leave here?" Lyle asked. "About 6 altogether," the man answered. Did you put them through the door into the letter box?" The postman said, "Yes, I always slip them into the box and ring and go away. The servants collect them from the inside." "Have you noticed if any of the letters you leave here bear a Russian postage stamp?" Lyle asked. The man answered, "Oh, yes, sir, a great many." "From the same person, would you say?" "The writing seems to be the same," the man answered. "They come regularly about once a week. One of them I delivered this morning had a Russian postmark." "That will do," said Lyle eagerly. Thank you very much." He ran back into the hall and, pulling out his penknife, began to pick at the lock of the letter box. "I have been supremely careless," he said in great excitement. "Twice before, when people I wanted had flown from a house, I have been able to follow them by putting a guard over their mailbox. These letters, which arrive regularly every week from Russia in the same handwriting, they can come but from one person. At least we shall now know the name of the master of this house. Undoubtedly it is one of his letters that the man placed here this morning. We may make a most important discovery." As he was talking, he was picking at the lock with his knife, but he was so impatient to reach the letters that he pressed too heavily on the blade, and it broke in his hand. I took a step backward and drove my heel into the lock and burst it open. The lid flew back, and we pressed forward, and each ran his hand down into the letter box. For a moment we were both too startled to move. The box was empty. I do not know how long we stood staring stupidly at each other, but it was Lyle who was the first to recover. He seized me by the arm and pointed excitedly into the empty box. "Do you appreciate what this means?" he cried. "It means that someone has been here ahead of us. Someone has entered this house not 3 hours before we came, since 11 o'clock this morning." "It was the Russian servant!" I exclaimed. "The Russian servant has been under arrest at Scotland Yard," Lyle cried. "He could not have taken the letters. Lord Arthur has been in his cot at the hospital. That is his alibi. There is someone else, someone we do not suspect, and that someone is the murderer. He came back here either to obtain those letters because he knew they would convict him, or to remove something he had left here at the time of the murder, something incriminating, the weapon perhaps, or some personal article, a cigarette case, a handkerchief with his name upon it, or a pair of gloves. Whatever it was, it must have been damning evidence against him to have made him take so desperate a chance." "How do we know," I whispered, "that he is not hidden here now?" "No, I'll swear he is not," Lyle answered. "I may have bungled in some things, but I have searched this house thoroughly. Nevertheless," he added, "we must go over it again, from the cellar to the roof. We have the real clue now, and we must forget the others and work only it." As he spoke, he began again to search the drawing-room, turning over even the books on the tables and the music on the piano. "Whoever the man is," he said over his shoulder, "we know that he has a key to the front door and a key to the letter-box. That shows us that he is either an inmate of the house or that he comes here when he wishes. The Russian says that he was the only servant in the house. Certainly we have found no evidence to show that any other servant slept here. There could be but one other person who would possess a key to the house and the letter-box, and he lives in St. Petersburg. At the time of the murder he was 2,000 miles away." Lyle interrupted himself suddenly with a sharp cry, and turned upon me with his eyes flashing. "But was he?" he cried. "Was he? How do we know that last night he was not in London, in this very house, when Zichy and Chetney met?" He stood staring at me without seeing me, muttering and arguing with himself. "Don't speak to me," he cried, as I ventured to interrupt him. "I can see it now. It is all plain. It was not the servant, but his master, the Russian himself, and it was he who came back for the letters. He came back for them because he knew they would convict him. We must find them. We must have those letters. If we find the one with the Russian postmark, we shall have found the murderer." He spoke like a madman, and as he spoke he ran around the room with one hand held out in front of him, as you have seen a mind-reader at a theatre seeking for something hidden in the stalls. He pulled the old letters from the writing desk and ran them over as swiftly as a gambler deals out cards. He dropped on his knees before the fireplace and dragged out the dead coals with his bare fingers, and then, with a low, worried cry, like a hound on a scent, he ran back to the waste-paper basket, and, lifting the papers from it, shook them out upon the floor. Instantly he gave a shout of triumph, and, separating a number of torn pieces from the others, held them up before me. "Look!" he cried. "Do you see? Here are 5 letters, torn across in 2 places. The Russian did not stop to read them, for as you see, he has left them still sealed. I have been wrong. He did not return for the letters. He could not have known their value. He must have returned for some other reason, and as he was leaving, saw the letter-box, and taking out the letters, held them together so, and tore them twice across, and then, as the fire had gone out, tossed them into this basket. Look," he cried, "here in the upper corner of this piece is a Russian stamp. This is his own letter, unopened." We examined the Russian stamp and found it had been cancelled in St. Petersburg 4 days ago. The back of the envelope bore the postmark of the branch station in Upper Sloane Street, and was dated this morning. The envelope was of official blue paper, and we had no difficulty in finding the 2 other parts of it. We drew the torn pieces of the letter from them, and joined them together side by side. There were but 2 lines of writing, and this was the message: "I leave Petersburg on the night train, and I shall see you at Trevor Terrace after dinner Monday evening." "That was last night," Lyle cried. "He arrived 12 hours ahead of his letter, but it came in time. It came in time to hang him." The baronet struck the table with his hand. "The name," he demanded. "How was it signed? What was the man's name?" The young solicitor rose to his feet and, leaning forward, stretched out his arm. "There was no name," he cried. "The letter was signed with only 2 initials, but engraved at the top of the sheet was the man's address. That address was the American Embassy, St. Petersburg Bureau, or the Naval Attaché. And the initials," he shouted, his voice rising into an exultant and bitter cry, "were those of the gentleman who sits opposite, who told us that he was the first to find the murdered bodies. The Naval Attaché to Russia, Lieutenant Sears." A strained and awful hush followed the solicitor's words, which seemed to vibrate like a twanging bowstring that had just hurled its bolt. Sir Andrew, pale and staring, drew away with an exclamation of repulsion. His eyes were fastened upon the naval attaché with fascinated horror, but the American emitted a sigh of great content, and sank comfortably into the arms of his chair. He clapped his hands softly together. "Capital," he murmured. "I give you my word I never guessed what you were driving at. You fooled me. I'll be hanged if you didn't. You certainly fooled me." The man with the pearl stud leaned forward with a nervous gesture. "Hush! Be careful!" he whispered. But at that instant, for the 3rd time, a servant, hastening through the room, handed him a piece of paper which he scanned eagerly. The message on the paper read, "The light over the commons is out. The house has risen." The man with the black pearl gave a mighty shout and tossed the paper from him upon the table. "Hurrah!" he cried. "The house is up. We've won." He caught up his glass and slapped the naval attaché violently upon the shoulder. He nodded joyously at him, at the solicitor, and at the Queen's messenger. "Gentlemen, to you," he cried. "My thanks and my congratulations." He drank deep from the glass and breathed forth a long sigh of satisfaction and relief. "But I say," protested the Queen's messenger, shaking his finger violently at the solicitor, "that story won't do. You didn't play fair, and you talked so fast I couldn't make out what it was all about. I'll bet you that evidence won't hold in a court of law. You couldn't hang a cat on such evidence. Your story is condemned tommy-rot. Now, my story might have happened. My story bore the mark—" In the joy of creation, the storytellers had forgotten their audience, until a sudden exclamation from Sir Andrew caused them to turn guiltily toward him. His face was knit with lines of anger, doubt, and amazement. "What does this mean?" he cried. "Is this a jest, or are you mad? If you know this man is a murderer, why is he at large? Is this a game you have been playing? Explain yourselves at once. What does it mean?" The American, with first a glance at the others, rose and bowed courteously. "I am not a murderer, Sir Andrew, believe me," he said. "You need not be alarmed. As a matter of fact, at this moment I am much more afraid of you than you could possibly be of me. I beg you please to be indulgent. I assure you we meant no disrespect. We have been matching stories, that is all, pretending that we are people we are not, endeavoring to entertain you with better detective tales than, for instance, the last one you read, the great Rand robbery." The baronet brushed his hand nervously across his forehead. "Do you mean to tell me," he exclaimed, "that none of this has happened? That Lord Chetney is not dead? That his solicitor did not find a letter of yours, written from your post in Petersburg, and that just now, when he charged you with murder, he was in jest?" "I am really very sorry," said the American, "but you see, sir, he could not have found a letter written by me in St. Petersburg, because I have never been in Petersburg. Until this week I have never been outside of my own country. I am not a naval officer. I am a writer of short stories, and tonight, when this gentleman told me that you were fond of detective stories, I thought it would be amusing to tell you one of my own, one that I had just mapped out this afternoon." "But Lord Chetney is a real person," interrupted the baronet, "and he did go to Africa 2 years ago, and he was supposed to have died there, and his brother Lord Arthur has been the heir. And yesterday Chetney did return. I read it in the papers." "So did I," assented the American soothingly, "and it struck me as being a very good plot for a story. I mean his unexpected return from the dead, and the probable disappointment of the younger brother. So I decided that the younger brother had better murder the older one. The Princess Zichy I invented out of a clear sky. The fog I did not have to invent. Since last night I know all there is to know about a London fog. I was lost in one for 3 hours." The baronet turned grimly upon the Queen's messenger. "But this gentleman," he protested, "he is not a writer of short stories. He is a member of the Foreign Office. I have often seen him in Whitehall, and, according to him, the Princess Zichy is not an invention. He says she is very well known, that she tried to rob him." The servant of the Foreign Office looked unhappily at the cabinet minister and puffed nervously on his cigar. "It's true, Sir Andrew, that I am a Queen's messenger," he said appealingly, "and a Russian woman once did try to rob a Queen's messenger in a railway carriage, only it did not happen to me, but to a pal of mine. The only Russian princess I ever knew called herself Zabrisky. You may have seen her. She used to do a dive from the roof of the aquarium." Sir Andrew, with a snort of indignation, fronted the young solicitor. "And I suppose yours was a cock-and-bull story too," he said. "Of course it must have been, since Lord Chetney is not dead. But don't tell me," he protested, "that you are not Chudley's son either." "I'm sorry," said the youngest member, smiling in some embarrassment, "but my name is not Chudley. I assure you, though, that I know the family very well, and that I am on very good terms with them." "You should be," exclaimed the baronet. "And judging from the liberties you take with the Chetneys, you had better be on very good terms with them, too." The young man leaned back and glanced toward the servants at the far end of the room. "It has been so long since I have been in the club," he said, "that I doubt if even the waiters remember me. Perhaps Joseph may," he added. "Joseph," he called, and at the word a servant stepped briskly forward. The young man pointed to the stuffed head of a great lion which was suspended above the fireplace. "Joseph," he said, I want you to tell these gentlemen who shot that lion. Who presented it to the grill?" Joseph, unused to acting as master of ceremonies to members of the club, shifted nervously from one foot to the other. "Why, you did," he stammered. "Of course I did," exclaimed the young man. "I mean, what is the name of the man who shot it? Tell the gentlemen who I am. They wouldn't believe me." "Who you are, my lord?" said Joseph. "You are Lord Edam's son, the Earl of Chetney." "You must admit," said Lord Chetney when the noise had died away, "that I couldn't remain dead while my little brother was accused of murder. I had to do something. Family pride demanded it. Now, Arthur, as the younger brother, can't afford to be squeamish, but personally I should hate to have a brother of mine hanged for murder." "You certainly showed no scruples against hanging me," said the American, "but in the face of your evidence I admit my guilt, and I sentence myself to pay the full penalty of the law as we are made to pay it in my own country. The order of this court is," he announced, "that Joseph shall bring me a wine card, and that I sign it for 5 bottles of the club's best champagne." "Oh, no," protested the man with the pearl stud. "It is not for you to sign it. In my opinion, it is Sir Andrew who should pay the costs. It is time you knew," he said, turning to that gentleman, "that unconsciously you have been the victim of what I may call a patriotic conspiracy. These stories have had a more serious purpose than merely to amuse. They have been told with the worthy object of detaining you from the House of Commons. I must explain to you that all through this evening I have had a servant waiting at Trafalgar Square, with instructions to bring me word as soon as the light over the House of Commons had ceased to burn. The light is now out, and the object for which we plotted is attained." The baronet glanced keenly at the man with the black pearl, and then quickly at his watch. The smile disappeared from his lips, and his face was set in stern and forbidding lines. "And may I know," he asked icily, "what was the object of your plot?" "A most worthy one," the other retorted. "Our object was to keep you from advocating the expenditure of many millions of the people's money upon more battleships. In a word, we have been working together to prevent you from passing the Navy Increase Bill." Sir Andrew's face bloomed with brilliant color. His body shook with suppressed emotion. "My dear sir," he cried, "you should spend more time at the House and less at your club. The Navy Bill was brought up on its 3rd reading at 8 o'clock this evening. I spoke for 3 hours in its favor. My only reason for wishing to return again to the House tonight was to sup on the terrace with my old friend, Admiral Simons, for my work at the House was completed 5 hours ago, when the Navy Increase Bill was passed by an overwhelming majority." The baronet rose and bowed. "I have to thank you, sir," he said, "for a most interesting evening." The American shoved the wine card which Joseph had given him toward the gentleman with the black pearl. "You sign it," he said. End of Section 3. End of In the Fog by Richard Harding Davis. Recording by Bob Gonzalez.